Welcome back to the sculpture, guys. Today we're going to be working on the details of the face and the drapery. We're not going to finish today. It's taking quite a bit of time. Drapery has got a long history. My favorite period in drapery in art is the Hellenistic period. And sculptors really took realism of drapery to new heights, and they focused a lot on the drama and the emotion of drapery. They had a very different style of drapery, which were very volume focused studies. Look at the Winged Victory in the Louvre, and you'll realize that the drapery in that sculpture is a whole lot different than traditional drapery studies. With drapery, it's important to understand the structure underneath. That's why in this sculpture, I started sculpting the female form entirely as if she were nude. And if you have a life model in front of you, you should always sculpt her nude first and then add the drapery on top. While I am working from photographs, the best study really is to have drapery in front of you and draping something that resembles that figure. With drapery, the drapery folds radiate from a tension point where the fabric is being pulled, such as the shoulders, elbows, or hips. You need to identify the tension where it begins and that creates the folds radiating out from one of these points. Gravity plays a key role in determining how the fabric flows down from these points. There's a balance between the contrast between a sharp and a soft fold that's going to add interest. I'm not at the point yet where I'm doing this, but sharper folds typically occur where the fabric is tightly stretched or being pulled, while softer folds are found where the fabric hangs loosely. The point that I am in this current sculpture is I am working with the larger drapery. I'm starting out by the general folds to get the major flow and the structure of the drapery. Once that's established, I gradually add smaller, more detailed folds. This helps keep the composition from feeling too busy too early. And I use tools that help with this because the folds of the drapery are so tiny. You need to consider your tools. And for me, for the drapery, I am using mostly the silicone tools that I tend to use for the body. This you can get refined folds and textures, and for delicate fabrics, you can carve out softer lines, and for heavier fabrics, you can use firmer strokes. You also have to consider the fabric's interaction with the figure. You need to observe how the fabric interacts with the body. In some cases, it might cling to the figure, while in others, it's going to billow out. This interaction brings a dynamic quality to the piece. And since I'm using photographs for reference, you need to observe the light and shadow. You need to pay attention how the light affects the folds and the creases. The play of the shadow and the highlight can enhance the illusion of depth and movement in your drapery. And also, I consider that you should study some historical examples. Hellenistic sculptures are the most excellent references for studying the flow of drapery, and they often portrayed highly dynamic and realistic fabric folds. Analyze the works from the period that inspires you. Drapery, also in water based sculptures such as I'm using, terracotta, and other types of water clays, can be a very clever way to provide structural support to a figure while adding aesthetic value. So there's some strategies that you can use. You can use drapery as the structural support as I'm using. You can connect the drapery to the base. You can create a balanced distribution of weight. And you can use thicker drapery folds with thicker clay for drapery. When sculpting drapery, try to consider making the folds slightly thicker. This added mass can contribute to the overall stability of the piece. and it reduces the risk of breakage, especially in areas prone to stress. It's the same thing with the hair. Because the neck on a female model tends to be very thin, I am glad that this model has very long flowing hair because the hair itself is the structure that holds up the neck. The neck would hold up regardless, but at the same time, it's better to have something supporting it. And there are strategic placements of drapery. Wrapping drapery around limbs, when the drapery wraps around limbs, for example, or the torso, it can help stabilize these areas. And there's also this cocooning effect. Consider using drapery to create a cocoon effect around the figure, enveloping it in a way that minimizes stress on individual elements. This can be particularly effective for delicate or intricate parts of the sculpture. And of course, in the previous video, I did do a hollowing technique. You need to hollow out the drapery as well. So as you sculpt, considering hollowing out areas for the drapery to account for shrinkage during the drying and firing. This helps reduce the risk of cracking and breaking while preserving the shape of the drapery. And you need to incorporate ventholes. Ventholes in the drapery folds to allow air to escape during the drying process. This can prevent air pockets that may lead to breaking and cracking. Some drapery might have texture, so you could use the texture to enhance. You could incorporate texture details in the drapery that can provide a more visual interest while offering additional grip on the underlying structure. I'm not very big on textures and doing textures, but if your drapery does have some, and I have seen some beautiful 19th century sculptures that have textures to them, if your cloth, your drapery has the texture, you do not have to put texture throughout the entire piece. You could just put a little bit and then trailer it off. It's a much better way of sculpting, in my opinion. Different fabrics have unique textures that influence how the folds flow. For example, silk is smooth and reflective, while linen has more of a pronounced weave. So you need to understand the characteristics of the fabric you are representing, while it's going to help you create more accurate textures. You also need to consider how the texture interacts with the light. Smoother textures reflect light differently than rough or wrinkled surfaces, affecting the overall appearance of your sculpture. You can use a silicone brush or a smooth metal piece to create that sheen. Even after it's fired, it will come to the surface. It's the same thing with any bones. Create that sheen and it creates a different texture in your sculpture. I've seen some sculptors use pieces of texture themselves to create the texture in their sculptures. I'm not big into that. I'm more of if I see a texture, I'll duplicate it. But my whole goal is not to create the entire piece in a very realistic way. I just wanted to, if you stand 10 feet away, your eyes are going to fill out the entire texture as opposed to creating this photorealistic sculpture of texture throughout. When you shape the hands, you need to be careful to the proportion and the detail. You could get carried away with the texture and the drapery that the hands will be too big or too small. You need to focus on achieving a natural pose that creates and conveys emotion or intent, capturing the intricate curves and textures of the skin. My goal with this sculpture is to have realistic hands, head, feet, and the drapery is going to be the added interest. It's going to make it really nice to have a beautiful drapery, but you also need to have things that are a little bit more realistic. For me, the main goal is to have the drapery slightly less realistic than the hands. I believe that creates more lifelike appearance with the sculpture. It adds more interest and it doesn't make it look like it's a 3D sculpture. I like when things resemble that they were made by a person. While the drapery for me is more of a creative approach by simplifying the folds and the textures rather than striving for hyperrealism, allowing the fabric to have a slightly exaggerated quality that adds character and life to sculpture, that's my aim. You need to use a little bit more of a bold, sweeping forms and flowing lines that capture movement and emotion, creating a dynamic contrast. Hopefully, at the end of this video, I'll be able to bring it all together. This series for me with the drapery study has been incredibly difficult. Normally, in the past, I would do these sculptures and I would do them rather quickly, but now I'm kind of busy with other projects, so it's taking a little bit more time. That is why I don't put up as many videos as before. And it is unfortunate because I do love sculpting and it just takes so much more time. But hopefully you guys are being patient for this series of sculpture. With all the mass of the drapery completed, I'm going to wrap up this video here. But don't worry, in the next video, we're going to continue refining this sculpture and enhancing this drapery. One important lesson I've learned throughout my sculpting journey is the value of patience. I used to rush and could complete a piece in just 2 hours. Now I take my time and I appreciate the process, knowing that each day brings me closer to a better sculpture. Stay tuned for the upcoming video and remember, good things take time.